music, and then I'll do a little intro, and then we'll get going.
Okay.
Spreaker.com, Kvole, SoundCloud.com, Kevole, YouTube at Kevin Olenek. You could add me as a friend on Facebook, Kevin Olenek, and of course follow me on Twitter at Kvole, Instagram, Kvole, and Patreon, Kvole. This is Agree or Disagree the podcast. I am your host, Kevin Olenek. Thank you for joining us for what I feel is a pretty important topic, actually, especially in light of the days that we are in. Online debate is something that we have all either seen or have participated in some ways. It's on our Facebooks, it's on our Twitter, it's on our news agencies are using it, radio station, magazines. There are things right now that are getting us really angry. There are people out there, not mentioning any names, Kevin, that like to, quote unquote, and I'm using air quotes, poke the bear and or stir the pot. And in some ways, it's a powerful tool to connect us together. Friends make friends. I've even seen dating relationships, develop from some of these conversations that I've had. But the problem is sometimes it is divisive. The intention of beginning with an intelligent discussion, bringing people together, leads sometimes to insults. Friends have ended friendships. People have blocked each other. Family members have cut out family members because of opinions. We've had death threats, stalking, and just complete flat-out insults, depending on your perspective. There is some connection, but we also are seeing a rise in anger and division. And some are still willing to dig in because they feel that their opinions are important, but some have backed off. And I'm going to be perfectly honest with you here. I've felt the last little bit I need to feel a little bit safer because of the intensity of the discussions even on my wall. People were legitimately angry at each other, and I was taking it to heart. My desire is to connect people together, not to divide. And I took some time to think about that, and we'll get into where I'm at later in this discussion. Because the discussions are important. But they are causing some mental anguish, some rage, some anger, and some hostility. It's not healthy. And I think people are feeling that there needs to be a change. But how? How do we have healthier and more productive online dialogue? Joining us to help with that is Martin Godwyn. Did I say that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. He has received his Ph.D. from the UBC in 2005, having acquired his M.Phil from Cambridge University and a B.A. Honours from Southampton University. His main philosophical interests lie in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, and the philosophy of Wittgenstein. We're going to have to talk about that. He has taught at a number of post-secondary institutions in the Vancouver area, including UBC, SFU, Kwantlen University, and BCIT. He's also right now at Kwantlen University. Is Kwantlen University?
It is, yes. Since I turned up. Yeah. Not because I turned up.
Oh, because you turned
That's a particular kind of fallacy, actually.
Yes, okay. Yes, it's not because of her. They should have that as a tagline. When not engaging in philosophical pursuits, he is often to be found hiking and snowshoeing the trails or climbing the mountains of Western Canada. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Glad to be here. I think this is a really important conversation, and I'm really curious what you are seeing being part of a number of universities, being part of a number of these discussions. What are you seeing right now in terms of how debate is being formed?
Well, there are several things, I think, that's pretty evident from online debate and indeed conversations that people have with each other down the pub and so on, which is, firstly, people are talking past each other a lot of the time, rather than talking with each other. A lot of the important values, a lot of the assumptions that people hold, a lot of the background views that people assume that other people share aren't always shared with other people. And when we engage in argument and discussion without having our background assumptions made clear and being open about those things, then it's harder to communicate with people in a rational and effective way. Another thing I think that is prevalent in contemporary debate is that certain views are becoming more vilified, less easy for people to express. They feel threatened and judged sometimes when they just express their views, and so they become more defensive when those views are criticized. They feel like that they themselves are being attacked and so on. I suppose, thirdly, one thing that particularly concerns me in my professional activities is that when people reason, they don't always reason very well. Most people think they're a lot smarter and more rational than, in fact, the evidence suggests that they are. And as a result, people think that they're making sense when, in fact, they're not always making sense, or drawing conclusions that perhaps shouldn't be drawn from the kinds of background assumptions or specific claims that they might make.
There's a lot to unpack there. Do you want to put your laptop
Sure.
There, or making sure that everybody's comfortable as we're doing this podcast? You mentioned, the first thing that you mentioned was some opinions are getting vilified. Can you expand on that a little bit?
So in order to have a genuine and open debate, the framework or the context in which the debate takes place needs to be an open one, where different views can be expressed and assessed objectively rather than reactively. I think a lot of people, when they encounter a view with which they disagree, are often judging the person rather than the statements that they're making or the views that they're holding, and often, far too often, I think, assuming things about the person's perspective and their background assumptions that may not be the case. One thing that I always find is that that when I make a claim on the internet, on Facebook or wherever, that people assume that I'm coming from a certain background, from a certain perspective, and rather than assessing the claims that I make, they assume that they assess or judge the background assumptions that they assume I'm coming to the debate with. My view is that if we were at least more open about that and more critically aware of our own assumptions, we would be less quick to judge other people on the basis of background assumptions, and we'd be able to actually communicate more effectively if we knew what other people think. One of the things that people don't spend enough time, I think, doing is asking people what they think. Rather, they tend to just assume that they know what the other person thinks and fills in the gaps and then judges them on the basis of that.
So, as an example, if one is let's use the low-hanging fruit here, the Trump supporter, or is perceived as a Trump supporter, there is an automatic label of racist, homophobe, this, that, the other. Mm-hmm. As opposed to, okay, what are you, like, why do you actually support Trump? And then from the other end, because I think it's important to, I don't think that this is just necessarily a one-sided thing. I don't know if you would agree with that. But there are even people that support, there's a Trudeau supporter, as an example, of people that defend Trudeau. There is this label of, well, you're part of the, I don't even know what this means, but the air quote of the left. And you're obviously this, and you're obviously that, and you're obviously the other thing, and I don't know if I really want to associate with you because you're, quote, ruining our country.
Right. And I think that there's a whole class of bad reasons that people give for dismissing other people's claims. The most common, perhaps, is what we call ad hominem arguments. So some feature of the individual that you use as a reason to reject their claims or to reject their arguments. And in the vast majority of cases, those reasons that people appeal to are going to be logically irrelevant to the claim they're making. So, for example, suppose a Trump supporter is a racist. Let's just suppose that there's a particular Trump supporter and they are, as it happens, racist. The fact that they're racist doesn't mean that they're wrong about the claims they make. It depends on what they make, what claims they make, and what reasons they give for those claims. To assess their claims rationally and objectively, you need to put aside those features of the individual that don't make a difference to the quality of the claims that they're making. Now, of course, it might be that they have certain prejudices, say racist prejudices, that lead them to make claims that are not well supported, in which case they're not well supported, but not because they're racist as such. They're simply not well supported.
Just not based on any fact.
Exactly. So dismissing a claim on the basis of some irrelevant feature of that person, such as their hair color, their ethnicity, their background, and so on. So, for example, when I'm engaging in debate, sometimes I'll say something, and it will be dismissed because I'm a liberal elitist, or that's the label that's going to be attached to me.
Is it because of the British accent?
It may have something to do with that, yeah. It may have something to do with the education, I don't know. There are all sorts of reasons they could use. But logically speaking, it wouldn't matter whether I was British or not, whether I was elitist or not, whether I was liberal or not, or any of these things. What matters is my claim true? And have I justified it? Have I given reasons to think that it's true? If we're going to assess an argument or a claim objectively, we have to look at the reasons rather than the person who's making the claim. If Hitler made the same argument as me, then his argument would likely be no better and no worse than my argument. If we're making the same argument,
right,
giving the same evidence and
right,
the same reasons, then the argument is just as good as each other. So our individual characteristics, whether it be the colour of our skin, our political views, whether we're liberal or heterosexual or male or female, usually will make no difference whatsoever logically to the claims that we're making. Yet there's a strong tendency of people to dismiss claims or attack claims by means of certain features of the individual, which are, generally speaking, logically irrelevant. So it doesn't matter, for example, in the context of the debate that you forwarded to me concerning Kinder Morgan. It doesn't matter, logically, whether you're from Alberta or BC. What matters are the reasons you give for being for or against a particular decision.
Right. Right. Yeah, so, you're saying, let's get away from what we think someone is saying, and that perception, and what they're actually saying.
Right, and that starts with listening to people.
Right.
Listen to what they actually say and focus on what they say rather than what you think the person is. Also, another feature which I know came up in the debate you forwarded to me concerns hypocrisy. Some people are hypocritical, but being hypocritical doesn't mean what you say is false. It doesn't mean you haven't provided good reasons for thinking what you say is true. So, for example, suppose I made a case for the claim that people should stop eating meat. And let's suppose that I was spotted being thoroughly hypocritical and tucking into a T-bone steak.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, I could be criticized for being hypocritical, but my arguments are none the worse for that. What I do, how I behave, is independent of the truth of the claim that I might give in favor of that claim.
But wouldn't that... See, we're debating.
Yes.
But but if you're eating a T-bone steak and you're telling people not to eat a T-bone steak, does that not automatically give us a perception of how you're presenting that argument? Because over 80% of our communication is nonverbal.
Yeah, sure. I think it's true that people will make that judgment. But the argument I give, assuming that the argument that I give doesn't depend upon my own actions. So if I'm saying to someone else, here's reasons why you shouldn't eat meat, and then I eat meat, I'm clearly acting in a way that's contradictory to the way that I think is the right way, or my argument suggests is the right way to act. But the argument is not affected by what I eat. I mean, to give another example, suppose that you go to the doctors and you tell them how much you've been drinking recently, and they say, if you continue to drink that way, it's going to harm your health. And they show you the evidence, they show you the studies, they present you with all sorts of good reasons to think that you should cut down on your drinking. If you happen to see that doctor down the pub later on that evening, smashed out of their head, it would be irrational of you to say, oh, well, I guess it's okay then for me to drink that amount. Given that they've showed you the evidence, how that person actually lives their life is going to be logically irrelevant to the evidence they've given.
So are you saying that facts aren't opinions?
No, what I'm trying to suggest is that we should distinguish which facts are relevant and which facts are not.
Okay.
So in any kind of argument, when we draw some claim from some other claim, the basis on which we make that claim, what we call the premises or assumptions in an argument. Those claims can be facts, but even if they're facts, it doesn't mean that they're relevant to the conclusion. So it might be a fact that you're from Alberta, but I wouldn't use that as a reason to dismiss your claims, even claims about BC or Alberta.
Right.
It wouldn't seem to make much sense to say, because you're from that particular place, that your claims lack validity. Generally speaking, whether your claims are valid or not, whether your claims are well-grounded or not, depends on what reasons you presented to support that claim, rather than where you're from. There are a whole host of aspects about individuals which are logically irrelevant to most of the claims that they make. Now, some claims that you make, especially if they're claims about yourself, then where you're from can be relevant. So, being from Alberta, I'm not from Alberta, but being from Alberta, you might speak with great authority about Albertan life and Alberta culture and so on. So you can have certain expertise in some areas if they're making a claim that's where your expertise or where you're from could be relevant to that. So I can speak a little bit about England and based on my experience from growing up there and so on. And that makes me, relative to you at least, somewhat more of an expert about England,
right,
just as you are about Alberta. But if we're talking about things such as, I don't know, healthcare systems and such like, it's not generally going to be relevant where we're from. What matters in almost every case is going to be what evidence have we brought to bear to support the claims we're making. There is a difference, of course, between opinions and facts. Everyone's entitled to opinions, but not everyone's entitled to the facts, which is to say some things can be justified more or less objectively, whilst other things aren't justified more or less objectively and are just opinions. But to have an opinion is not to say that your opinion isn't also a fact. I don't want to draw a hard distinction between the two, because sometimes your opinion can be supported by the evidence, in which case we can, I think, justifiably call it a fact.
Right. So I think one of the things that is leading, I usually have notes, I'm going to be honest. I knew I was going to wing this because I knew that we were going to dig some stuff out, and I have some ideas. But one of the things that I'm hearing, and one of the things that I'm wondering about is tone. Because, if someone sends me an email and it's a bit critical, I don't think these may not be the intention of the person to criticize, but it comes across that way because I'm feeling a certain way about it. Are we sensing that in terms of our online conversation, that maybe this is taken, I don't want to say taken the wrong way, but taken in the lens of our own eyes, not in the intention of the person that's actually delivering it. So what's coming across may be harsh or critical in some people's eyes. I mean, there's not an intent in that for being harsh and critical. That's just their opinion.
Yeah, I think that's true psychologically. Psychologically, people are influenced by their emotional states. They're influenced by their assumptions about other people, rather than the specific claims that people are making. Logically, that shouldn't make a difference. I mean, it's the content of what I say that makes a difference to the truth of what I say, not how I say it. If I say something in an aggressive tone and I say something in a friendly tone, the content is exactly the same, and so the truth of the claim shouldn't be affected by the way I say it. But the fact of the matter is, as human beings with emotions, we are affected by the way that we perceive the tone of the comment. So it's true that that happens, and it gets in the way, I think, of getting closer to the truth, which is often the goal, not always, but often the goal of online discussions and debates. But often it's not the goal. Sometimes the person is not interested in presenting an argument. Sometimes they're interested in just expressing their views, having a forum for saying what they think, and not really interested in arguing about it. So when someone challenges them on that, they might react in a less than friendly way. They might feel threatened by it or criticized or so on. So I do think that our emotions do get in the way, especially our perceptions of other people. People can be dismissed one way or another on the basis of where they're from or what they assume their background beliefs are. If they're from Alberta, people will make assumptions about the person's beliefs and opinions and so on about the development of oil and gas, for example, and the Kinder Morgan pipeline and so on. Sometimes those background beliefs will be justified, but most of the time they're just background assumptions. And we should always focus on what people say rather than what we think they would say or what we think their opinions and views are.
Now, by the way, just to tease you, we are actually going to go through I sent Martin the thread to the Kinder Morgan debate that I had on my Facebook wall. And we're going to talk about that. And because one of the things that I wanted to do is find some of the stuff that I do online and bring this to light, not because I'm trying to necessarily call anyone out. That's not it. I think it's just a really good analysis of what we're seeing. Because what I'm seeing on my Facebook page is not necessarily any different than I'm seeing anywhere else, but I want to also improve, and I think want to improve that dialogue. So it leads me to two other questions before we get into that. Is there a difference? Are you noticing a difference between, like, if you have a group of students right now that are talking, let's say we had 6 students, we brought them together to have that same debate about Kinder Morgan that we had online. What would the behavior be like? Are you seeing a difference between the way that we converse face-to-face and the way that we converse online?
I think it depends on the specific context in which people are conversing face-to-face. I mean, my primary job is in education, so what I try to do is encourage debate, but I'm also there to facilitate debate, not just to let people loose and let them get at it. So, for example, a student may make a comment, but I think there may be a problem with the comment. Not that it's necessarily false, but it may be that their inference is a dubious one, and so I'll reflect on that and try to encourage them to reflect upon that, primarily through asking questions or giving possible counterexamples that might question the inference that they're making. So in that context, I don't think there's necessarily too much difference. For the most part, debates online go ahead without any kind of facilitator. People just go at it with each other. Now, in your case, you have occasional points where you step in and you just try to direct the theme or the content of the discussion in a particular direction according to
I used to not do that.
You used to not do that?
I used to just let it go.
Yeah. And how did that work out for us?
It did not, actually. But, well, because I do want to talk about moderation, because I do think it's very important. My struggle is my theory is you as a person on a keyboard are responsible for what you say. I can't control what you say. I can certainly turn that and say, okay, maybe we need to look at it this way. But at the same time, I wonder if we are becoming afraid of emotion and afraid of the fact that someone is actually going to be angry. Because as Canadians, I think I don't want to say, this is a generalization about Canadians. I think we feel we're the worst sorries of the earth, and we want to apologize for having an opinion and getting emotional. And we see some people that get emotional and have the ability, subconsciously or consciously, to rile that other person up, and we're like, oh man, that's emotional. People are getting angry, and I don't know what is wrong with me having people being angry. Because there is a stake in that, right? And when we look at the Kinder Morgan, on both sides of that debate, and I kind of let that go intentionally, both sides of that debate, there is legitimate reasons to have an emotional opinion. One side is talking about jobs, the other side is talking about their land.
Right. I think there's a straightforward answer to your question, what's wrong with emotions. It leads us further away from the truth and makes it harder for us to see the truth. If we're making judgments on the basis of our emotions, generally speaking, our emotions are not going to connect with the truth, or they're going to cloud the issue.
Okay.
Now, this is not to say that people shouldn't be emotional. They can be emotional, but it's very important to recognize, I think, that our emotional reactions get in the way of getting at the truth. If we're particularly attached to a particular view, or we're particularly concerned out of, let's say, legitimate self-interest about a particular issue, I noticed some of the comments on the discussion that you put up on Kinder Morgan. A lot of the comments were concerned with people's self-interested and legitimate self-interested aspects, which lead them to think that the decision would be good or bad for them personally. So they might have relatives who are involved in the natural gas industry or the oil industry. And so they presumably will care about their future, their interests, their jobs, and so on. And the question, though, if you think of it in terms of an argument, suppose someone were to say, the Kinder Morgan pipeline should go ahead, and the reason for that is Bob X will continue to have their job. That's not much of a reason for it to go ahead. It's a psychological motivation, but not much of a reason. A lot of the time, people are providing their psychological motivations, which cause them to believe certain things or to want certain things, without necessarily providing reasons to think that what they're claiming is true. So someone who has a psychological motivation for Kinder Morgan pipeline going ahead, say they've got a self-interest in it, they're employed in the industry, for example, or yes, they think it's important for their local economy. These things are often psychological motivations rather than reasons. And the difference between psychological motivations and reasons can be very, very important and tragically very hard to distinguish sometimes. If we were completely rational, then the reasons for our beliefs, the causes of our beliefs, I should be more specific, the causes of our beliefs would be the reasons for thinking our belief is true. But we're not completely rational. We're often motivated by factors that have nothing logically to do with the truth of the claim that we're trying to establish. And so I think emotions, they can get in the way. They can get in the way of finding the truth. They can get in the way of an objective assessment of the evidence. We are emotional creatures and we can't help that. But if the goal is to get at the truth, I think that emotion has to be kept in restraint when we're concerned with getting at the truth. I think often people are engaging online and in ordinary conversations too. I don't think there's a fundamental difference here, really. They're interested in persuading other people rather than getting at the truth. They're interested in expressing their views rather than whether their views are right or wrong. And there are all sorts of other motivations, and perfectly legitimate motivations in certain contexts. I think it's important to know what the goal of the conversation is and what standards are being used in order to assess the quality of various responses. I think emotions do tend to get in the way. If someone's feeling fearful, for example, then they may not appeal to certain evidence that they might otherwise appeal to if they weren't fearful of the reactions they're going to get, for example. Similarly, if someone has a particular interest in a particular claim being true, they may appeal to pity. There's a particular kind of fallacy we call appeal to pity, or ad misericordiam, to use the Latin, where we try to persuade someone that something's true because if it's not true, then it really sucks for us. But generally speaking, it not being true or the truth of the matter is irrelevant to whether we're going to suffer from it or not. It would be lovely if unicorns existed. It would be wonderful if Santa Claus existed.
What?
Sorry.
Hold on here.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Sorry. Well, hypothetically, let's suppose that Santa Claus doesn't exist. The evidence, as best I can assess it, points in the direction of Santa Claus not existing. Now, that might make me feel sad is not logically relevant to the truth of the question, right? Whether Santa Claus exists or not isn't really affected about whether I'm happy about it or not. Whether the Kinder Morgan whether the Kinder Morgan pipeline would have certain consequences for the Canadian economy or for the local environment, etc., those questions are, logically speaking, completely independent of whether I'm happy or sad about such possibilities. So I think it's very important to keep our emotions to one side when we're concerned with the truth. Of course, we're not always just concerned with the question of truth. We're often concerned with trying to persuade people, which isn't always the same thing.
And what's the difference in your mind?
Well, we all like to think we're right. I think the first thing that people should be aware of is that they're not as good at reasoning as they probably think that they are. When I teach critical thinking, one of the first things I tell to my students, and it hasn't yet gotten me in trouble, but it might do, is I tell them that all my students are stupid. Now, I soften that blow by pointing out that I'm stupid too, that we're all stupid to varying degrees. Psychologists have identified a wide variety of cognitive biases that we have that lead us to draw the wrong inference from the evidence. So here's one typical thing that happens both online and in everyday conversation. Someone might make a claim, another person might disagree with that claim. Now, what do? Well, one thing they might do is they'll go searching the internet, trying to find some sources that are going to support their view. The first thing they do is to find reasons to think that they're right. But that's already a biased perspective. If you're going to be objective, you should search at least as equally for reasons to think that you're wrong. In many contexts, the job is not to find the truth. The motivations that lead people to engage in these kinds of discussions are often the desire to show someone else is wrong, or conversely to show that the beliefs they already have are right.
So even like when people are posting facts and opinions, some of it is dismissed because, and maybe we need to talk about sourcing material, because I do think that this is an important part. But it's posting a source material, whatever it is, because I'm gonna distance myself from like right wing, left wing, because the right will say that there's a left bias, and the left wing perspective is going to say that there's a right wing bias. So we know that there's a presumed bias already in this. But okay, you're posting this, and I don't like it, and I'm not going to read it because it's based on that fact. Right. So maybe we need to have a conversation about finding good source material and how,
and about bias, I think, because it's often misunderstood. A biased view is not the same thing as a strong view. You can have a strong opinion, you can be very opinionated and not be biased, or rather your view will not necessarily be a biased view. Bias only matters when we don't have evidence. Bias matters when no other reason is being given other than a person saying so, and they're not an expert in the field, let's say. So if I provide evidence to support my claim, then my bias is not generally going to be relevant to the assessment of my claim. It should be assessed on the basis of the evidence that I provide, assuming the evidence is objective. We'll come to that as well, I think. So, for example, suppose I'm in the market for a new car, and my top priority is having the safest car that I can afford to buy. And I go into a sales room, and the salesperson, they're on commission. They'll probably get a higher commission if they sell me the more expensive car. And they show me 3 models. The most expensive model happens to be the safest vehicle. Now, let's suppose that they justify that claim that it's the safest vehicle by showing you independent reports from various sources showing this is a really safe vehicle. And it's within my price range. Now, I think they've given me a reason to buy that vehicle. I might say to myself, yeah, but they are biased. After all, they've got a self-interest in selling me the more expensive vehicle. They'll get a higher commission. But logically speaking, their bias becomes irrelevant, given that they've shown me good, objective reasons for thinking this is the car that I should have. Now, a lot of the time, people's biases, and they may well be there. I mean, there are often biases. We all have certain biases in that respect. It doesn't mean that our claims are biased. We may be biased. But if our claim is backed up by objective evidence, then our individual biases cease to become relevant.
Right.
So the real question is, have I provided good reasons for thinking that the claim is true? If I have, then any biases I may have become irrelevant to the issue. Now, of course, there are some cases where the bias is going to be important. If the person hasn't provided any good reasons for thinking the claim is true, and the only authority that we have for thinking the claim is true is their opinion, then that's, I think, an appropriate point to pause and say, okay, where's the evidence? Where's the reason? So if the salesperson says this is the safest vehicle in its class but provides no evidence, then it's, I think, appropriate to feel concerned about their potential bias. Then their bias can be, from a critical thinking perspective, a particularly important thing. But not if they provided good reasons for thinking it's true.
Okay. So, and then in terms of sourcing materials to base that on, what kind of criteria are you suggesting to your students?
Right. Well, so
and also, how do we? This is the easiest way to do it. I'm not being biased, but I think this is the most easiest way to do this. Someone posts an Alex Jones article. Now, there's some sensationalism to an Alex Jones article, no question about it. But how do you separate that from the actual fact? Because like it or not, there is a bit of, at least a bit of truth in what Alex Jones is saying, and that's what he's selling that on, right? It's sensationalism because there's an entertainment in, for Alex Jones, what he does. I don't like what he does, but skillfully, he has a skill in presenting that, and maybe that's another thing we need to talk about, is the skill of presenting your argument. And the actual modicum of a little bit of truth, or catching that headline. Yeah.
Well, I think that one of the main problems for productive debate generally is that people don't always agree on what the appropriate sources to go to are in order to establish the facts. When we disagree, we can disagree on a number of different things. One of the things we might disagree on are the facts. We might disagree on other things as well. We might disagree on values. We might agree on what the facts are, but be led to different conclusions because we prioritize different things, we value different things, and that's often the case. In the Kinder Morgan debate, for example, you can find people agreeing on what the facts are, but disagreeing on what's most important. Is it more important to, say, promote economic growth, or is protecting the environment more important? These are differences not of facts so much as values. But if we do disagree on facts, we need to resolve that disagreement somehow. And that can only be done if we agree at least on who we can go to in order to establish what the facts are. In our society, and I think with some good reason, on facts about the natural world at least, science has an authority which is hard to beat, because science has a set of methods that help to minimize bias. By having certain methodologies, scientists can more closely approach the truth in an objective way than most other sources. But of course, just because a scientist says something, it doesn't follow that that's automatically true. It's a fact. I mean, scientists can be biased as well. And more importantly, I think, people, when they're appealing to science in order to try and establish something, they will often pick their sources according to their needs. So they'll pick sources that will support the conclusion that they want to infer, they want to arrive at. And this goes back to the point I mentioned earlier on. When someone is engaged in debate, the first thing they tend to do is to find sources that's going to support them. And the most authoritative sources they can find, such as some scientist here, there, or some scientific paper here or there that support it, they'll pick on that, they'll focus on that, and completely ignore or won't even go looking for those sources, equally authoritative sources perhaps, that support an alternative point of view. So it's a difficulty. Obviously, once you get into a framework of thinking where certain sources are automatically to be disregarded, then that's going to be a problem. It seals off that as a possible source of knowledge. Now, sometimes that's for good reason. Sometimes certain sources are going to be unreliable because they're not justifying their claims by appeal to the truth.
And there's a history of that happening a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that comes into play. So if you're presenting this from this perspective, well, they've, this, that, the other, history has a play in that.
Sure. I mean, so I've heard some bad arguments. I mean, I'm vegetarian. I've heard some bad arguments and some good arguments in favor of vegetarianism. One of the criticisms I've heard against vegetarians, for example, is that Hitler was a vegetarian, which, if you think about it, has absolutely nothing to do with whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Right? I think the sources, there are some sources that we can legitimately consider to be authoritative. If someone's speaking within their area of expertise, if there's no good reason to think that they're speaking from a position of bias rather than evidence, if there's no good reason to think that there is significant controversy within equally qualified or amongst equally qualified experts concerning that matter, then they can speak as an expert in that field and they count as a good source to go to. But there's always this problem that people will pick their sources to suit their ends. So take the climate change debate. There are certain experts out there who are considerably more skeptical about the causes of climate change than the majority. The consensus, the vast majority of scientists are very clear that there's a very strong case for thinking that it's primarily human-caused. But there are some scientists, very well-qualified individuals, who take a different view. Now, if you have a climate skeptic, then the individual is likely to go straight to those sources and ignore the vast majority of scientists. So doing that is not an objective way of trying to establish the truth. So, yeah, I agree. I think there is a lot of difficulty, and unless or until there is agreement on what sources we can go to in order to determine what the facts are, there's very little prospect of reaching general agreement.
And I can certainly understand that. And maybe that's a process of a longer conversation through time. But do you think that I wonder if people are get into this with trying to win, because there's I'm sure you notice this too, and I always notice this. There are people that are far more skilled at presenting an argument than others. Like that's a fact. And is it about winning? Is it the air quote I won the debate?
Yes.
Yeah. Or is it about listening?
Right. I agree. Lots of people. Some people are more skilled at debate than others. In different contexts, it can be about winning. I mean, if you're a lawyer in court, you have a duty to defend your client to the best of your ability, and that means winning the particular case, presenting the most persuasive argument that you can find. That's the problem with that, is that a persuasive argument is not always a rational argument. So you can have persuasive arguments that do not provide any rational grounds for accepting the conclusion. And those techniques, those skills, are mastered by a variety of different disciplines and professions. Lawyers are specialists in that. Advertising executives are specialists in the ability to persuade people to believe things, independently of there being good reasons for believing certain things. That is a problem insofar as one's concerned with the truth. I mean, my profession, we prize the truth. And if the logic and the reason and the evidence lead in a certain direction, then that's the direction that we believe we should go. It's not always a comfortable direction to go. It's sometimes a very difficult journey. Most of us don't like to change our views. Most of us would like certain things to be true. But if the evidence points against their truth, then the rational response, the conscientious rational response, would be to change our views. But it's not easy to do that. People don't like changing their views. We're not built, from an evolutionary perspective, we're not built in order to find the truth. We're built to reproduce and survive, which isn't always connected with the truth. There are some beliefs that we have which evolution has selected for, or dispositions, I should be more precise, certain dispositions we have which evolution has selected for, which may help us to reproduce, but aren't necessarily objective. We tend to think of ourselves more highly than the objective evidence would probably warrant. We tend to think we're smarter than we are. About 80% of people apparently think they're better than average drivers. This is not unusual. These kinds of things have been shown over and over again. We tend to think in unobjective ways. And evolution is selected for that, because we don't need to be. If we were objective, we might not get a date on a Saturday night. If we think we're the hottest thing on the dance floor, our chances of reproducing are probably a little higher. And evolution selects for that, regardless of whether there's an objective basis for it or not.
Before we get into Kinder Morgan and moderation, I think the other question that I have is wading into this one. There's some people out there that they don't never participate. They read and they get informed. That's great. And sometimes I hear, I really want to get into it, but I don't feel I'm very necessarily qualified to get into this. Or I'm scared that my opinion is going to blow up in my face. What's your comment towards that? And when I'm thinking about that, I think one of the things that I think right now is a frightening conversation, maybe definitely for men right now, is the Me Too conversation. So kind of talk about how to wade in intelligently, respectfully, what recommendations you have for that.
Well, this is a tricky one, partly because I'm a man.
Right.
So if I have...
But the advice to the men, if they want to wade in, or do they stand out, or...
But that's precisely my point, insofar as any comments I might have about how men are to wade in might be criticized by certain portions, certain individuals, that it's not for a man to say how men should wade into conversations about essentially, for the most part, women or transgender or transsexual issue,
right.
about
but
LGBTQ issue.
But stepping into uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. It's a very sensitive and difficult issue. I think that if the goal is truth, we have to keep our emotions in check. Go back to a point I made earlier on. If we're intending to find out what the truth is, if our goal is that, then our emotions are more likely to get in the way than to help. Right? There are, on the other hand, of course, we don't want to hurt people's feelings. We don't want to offend people. Balancing those two goals in a social context, when we're engaging with people with social media and so on, is not an easy task. Sometimes the truth hurts, sometimes the truth offends. And so pursuing the truth at all costs is likely to hurt people's feelings. Even if you're wrong, I mean, I'm talking about the pursuit of truth. You can still pursue truth and find yourself with a false opinion. But just pursuing truth means raising certain questions. And some of those questions are uncomfortable questions. So it's very difficult, I think, for me to speak in a general way about that particular topic. I think I would certainly agree that there is an atmosphere of fear in some quarters concerning the possible repercussions or reactions that particular comments might have, even if the comments are intended to be well-meaning, well-intentioned, and in no way derogatory or disrespectful of anyone's persons or opinions.
Right.
So I think it's a very, very difficult issue, and that's a whole topic for another discussion.
Right. And in terms of moderation, what advice do you give to us moderators?
First thing, keep people on topic. It's very easy for people to go off in irrelevant directions. So, for example, in the Kindermorgen debate, people started talking about our dependence on oil as a nation. Whereas that's probably true, but if the Kindermorgen pipeline is about exports to other countries, our dependence on oil as a nation, in terms of our own consumption of the oil, would not seem to be so relevant. It's going to be pretty much impossible to stop people from having emotional reactions. But when I'm trying to facilitate debate in a philosophical context or a critical thinking context, I try to keep people on the topic. Be clear what the question is, first of all. Now, again, don't take this the wrong way. When I looked at your post, I was a little unclear exactly what the question was that you were asking. So, for example, I think you said something like, here's your opportunity to explain why you think it's a good idea or
yeah,
bad idea.
My explanation on that really was I have friends, and you saw that, but I do have friends that live near, and you have worked at SFU. We were talking off air about how beautiful that land is, and there's a beauty in that. And I'm hearing BC, people in BC, my friends in BC, my contacts in BC are like, yes, this is great. And then my friends in Alberta are like, well, this actually is impacting what I need to do with my life. And I felt like there needs to be a conversation about this. And I think people need to listen to each other. So my goal really in that case was have the floor, share your perspective.
Okay, sure. So that's one particular goal. Now, sharing perspective isn't necessarily about arriving at the truth. It's more about finding understanding of another person's point of view. So there's a distinct goal there, right? So in asking people to explain what makes them happy, what makes them unhappy about the Kindermorgen decision, that opens up the floor. It opens the floor to argument, but a lot more else other than argument. It opens up the floor for people simply to express what they like or don't like about it, or how it affects them as individuals, which can be reasons in certain contexts, but it doesn't have to be a reason. So to say, if someone could say, this affects me in this way, this is why I'm unhappy about it, but perfectly consistently they can say, I'm in favor of the decision all the same, because I think it's the right decision for other reasons. As an opportunity for people to try to gain understanding and hopefully to diffuse some of the misunderstandings that may occur from one side or the other side about the whole issue, what motivates people. I think it's a great opportunity for people to be able to do that. But I just wanted to say that explaining why people are happy or unhappy about the decision isn't necessarily the same thing as about providing reasons for thinking the decision's a good one or a bad one. So
you would suggest... Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
Yeah, go ahead.
You would suggest, why do you feel this way?
Yeah.
Provide some evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Exactly. The problem with the English language is that it's terribly ambiguous. So just asking, why do you think that, or why do you feel that way? You could be asking for people to explain their feelings, or you could be asking them to provide reasons to think that what they think is true. Right? And those are two different tasks. So, famous example, a number of years ago now, I think it was Jonathan Edwards, I think the candidate for Democratic American presidency candidate, I think. There was a debate. And he was asked by the person in the debate, so you're on record as being against same-sex marriage. Why is that? And he paused for a second and then said, that's just how I was raised. Which is an explanation for his beliefs, is perfectly cogent, makes perfect sense. People are raised in certain ways and they tend to have certain feelings and beliefs and so on.
Right.
But as a reason to be against same-sex marriage, it's an appalling reason. I mean, it just doesn't count as a reason at all.
Yeah, it's not based on any fact.
Well, it's based on the following fact that he was raised that way. He was raised to be against same-sex marriage. But that's not a reason to be against same-sex marriage. That's just what causes him to be against same-sex marriage.
Right, okay.
Right? So when we're providing explanations, we're talking about the causes and the motivations and so on that lead us to have certain beliefs. If we were perfectly rational, then those causes and motivations would be connected to reasons, grounds to think that the belief is a true one. But giving a justification for a belief and providing an explanation for that belief, a cause, are not the same tasks. They're different tasks. So just asking, why do you think that? It's ambiguous, I think, a little bit, between providing reasons to think that it's true and providing an explanation for your mental state of believing that it's true. They're often confused together, partly because in the English language, we use the same words to give both. If I want to give you an explanation, I might use the word because. I say, this is true because, and then I might give a reason. So, this is true because, or this happened because. We use this word because in both contexts, sometimes to give explanations, sometimes to give arguments. If we were perfectly rational, this difference wouldn't matter at all. But often people are giving explanations which logically have no bearing on the reasons to think the claim is true. So I think it's Jonathan Edwards was his name. He gave no reasons to think that people should be against same-sex marriage, because him being raised, that particular individual being raised in a particular way, doesn't seem to be much of a reason to think same-sex marriage is a bad idea. But he gave a perfectly good explanation. Right? People do tend to think certain things depending on how they are raised. That can explain or help to explain why people have the views that they do. It explains, but doesn't necessarily justify. And understanding that distinction, I think, is really important, because if you want to get at truth, it's the justifications that matter. So we need to be clear exactly what the question is asking. If we know whether the question is asking for an explanation, we provide certain kinds of answers, and they may be good, they may be bad, as those kinds of answers demand. But if we don't know what's being asked, then people will often find themselves providing explanations, perhaps their own self-interested motivations that lead them to believe certain things, when in fact what's really being asked is a justification, grounds to think that a claim is true or a claim is false. And I don't know whether you try to do both things at once when you open up the debate, but I think both...
I try to, yeah. For me, it's a... Sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
I think both things were happening.
Yeah.
Some people were giving explanations and some people were giving arguments.
Yeah. I try to, and, I try to keep... When I started this, I really tried to keep my opinion out of it. And some were like, well, I want to hear your opinion. And I'm like, well, it's not really about my opinion. I actually want to seek your opinion. But then I've been able to generate my own opinion, and I think there's times when it's appropriate to add my opinion in something. And that's been something that's been a personal struggle of mine. Do I just sit back and not say my opinion and just leave the floor? And if I do present an opinion, is that showing a bias one way or another?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, even today. So earlier on today, I was lecturing in my business ethics class.
Yeah.
And I can't remember now what the exact topic was. I can't remember what the topic was, but one student asked me, "What do you think?" And my response, and this is a stock response that I tend to give, is, "My opinion is not important. Your opinion is important."
Right.
So what my role is, as an educator, is to help other people find their way through to a coherent position, whatever that position is. So if they make a claim, I would challenge that claim, whether I agree with their claim or not.
Right, because your desire is for intelligence. Yeah.
Exactly. So one of the main goals that I have as an educator is to help people to understand that whatever view they hold, there's usually, almost always, something to be said for a different point of view. So my goal is not to change people's views or to shape their views as such, but to give them the opportunity to find out what their own views are. Generally speaking, I tell people, you'll probably leave with the same views as you came in with. But by the time you leave, you'll at least understand, firstly, why it is you think those things, because your claims will be tested and challenged and so on. You'll have to come up with good reasons. And secondly, you'll gain an appreciation for why other people hold different views from you, because reasons will be given for different points of view. And so my goal is not to, my views, I do very strongly keep them in the background. It is possible for the attentive student to usually figure out certain perspectives that I may have on some things. Occasionally I will state my view on a subject that isn't necessarily so directly concerned with the subject matter. I think that's what it was about. It's about whether I agreed with Milton Friedman's analysis of the responsibilities of businesses. Milton Friedman is a free market capitalist. He thinks that businesses have no responsibilities except to obey the law and to seek a profit. And that's it. That's their only responsibilities. And someone asked me whether I agreed with that. Now, I do have views about that. But I firmly said, my opinions really don't matter. It's your opinions that matter. My job here is to help you, not to tell you what to do.
That's what your paycheck is about.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Right.
And I think that's probably good advice for moderators in general. I mean, if you're actually genuinely being moderator, you have to be perceived as unbiased. Right? Otherwise, if you're not perceived as unbiased, then it's going to get in the way of people. They're going to dismiss your views, etc., etc. So I think it's helpful if you're perceived as being unbiased. Now, I think in my case, I can ask questions.
Right.
So asking questions, I think, is a good way to get people thinking further or thinking more deeply through the issues that they're tackling.
Yeah. So let's go through, before we close off, we've teased it, let's go through the Kinder Morgan debate, and without naming names. Because, let's kind of talk about what we're seeing here.
So,
Am I going too fast for
you?
Yeah. Okay, we'll start at the top.
Sure. So what you have is an invitation to people to express what makes them happy or unhappy about a decision concerning Kinder Morgan. What most of the debate seemed to then revolve around was value differences rather than... Well, there are two things, really. One was value differences. Many people kept coming back to the claim that it's in Canada's economic interest for it to go ahead. And that was largely unchallenged, that it was in Canada's economic interests. What was brought up as a counter to that often was environmental concerns about the possible risks. A third dimension that came up, a third dimension of concern for some people, was the question of who gets to decide on these matters. Should it be left to provinces to make decisions like this, or should it be the responsibility of the federal government to make these kinds of decisions? A lot of people also, I think, basically spoke from the perspective of their own personal interests, which doesn't necessarily get us closer to the truth. It does allow people an opportunity to explain what it is that that motivates them about this particular decision, what they like, what makes them happy, what makes them unhappy about it, without necessarily providing reasons to decide whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. Right? Yeah, so I think...
Scroll down?
Yeah, sure.
Turns on notifications. Tell me when to stop.
Okay. Well, I don't have this committed to memory, so I can't really recall without reading it through exactly what points. I do. I mean, as I say, I think a lot of people came back to the question of the economic issues here rather than other issues. Now, that's a value judgment. If someone says increasing or improving the economic productivity of Canada, increasing or boosting our economy is the most important thing, then they will often use words like necessary. It's economically necessary. Canada needs to get this oil shipped out. That's a value judgment at the end of the day. And that's
been Kenny's argument in this, too.
Okay.
And this has been the Alberta, maybe the Alberta perspective, right? It's the economic kind.
Right. And that's a value judgment, right, at the end of the day. Do we prioritize economic prosperity over all other matters? Yeah. If there is a difference of view about that value judgment, then it's unlikely to be resolved. I mean, it's unlikely you're going to get agreement, but you may get understanding. If people understand each other correctly, then that's a good thing. They may not come to agreement, though, through that understanding. You can get understanding without agreement.
Right.
They might simply have different values as to some person may think, okay, yes, maybe it's true that it's in the economic interests of Canada that the Kinder Morgan pipeline be built. Maybe. But that doesn't mean that they'll support it because they may prioritize what they perceive to be as significant risks for the environment. Now, there's the other question of fairness. So even if it is in the interest of Canada economically to get this oil to the coast, it might be that the risks are borne essentially or primarily by British Columbians rather than Albertans. If that's the case, then there's the question of whether that's fair. Is it fair for British Columbia to take on these potential risks? Of course, some will disagree as to whether there are factually significant risks or not. That's a distinction. That's a difference in about facts. But there's the question, the moral question, the value question, if you like, is it fair for British Columbians to bear the risks for the sake of the economic interests of Canada as a whole, given that it is in Canada's overall economic interest?
There's a longer thread here that has 20 replies. So I'm going to read, because we're doing this through audio, I'm going to read the start of it. Again, I'm not picking on anybody, we're just quoting, okay? So I want that to be clear for those that are listening that did participate. Appreciate the participation as well. I can see Alberta's side of this. And this is from someone that is on the side of BC. So, and I actually love this comment. To step back, this is a really intelligent comment. I can see Alberta's side of this. They need the money and jobs, but BC has a side of it too. Our resources are agriculture, logging, and fishing, and of course tourism. All of these could be impacted by a serious oil spill. And then we have Kinder Morgan. A friend of mine was part of a regulatory process, and what he told me was enough to make me say no to the whole thing. He described it as a rubber stamping process with no room for negotiations or questions. KM would not even share their fire safety plan for the tank farm with the Burnaby Fire Department, the ones who would presumably be fighting the fire. This is insane, and many of us aren't willing to go along with it. And there's 20 other replies specifically to this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in that particular opening comment, what you get is a recognition of the interests that are served by the various parties, depending on whether the Kinder Morgan pipeline goes ahead or not. It's clear that there are aspects there are reasons for Albertans to support the Kinder Morgan pipeline going ahead. Jobs, money, etc. And there are, at least given certain environmental assessments and certain concerns over fire and oil spills and so on, there might be reasons for British Columbians to be opposed to it. The question, though, is should it go ahead? If that's the question, should it go ahead, then those interests need to be balanced somehow. We have to ask the question of, are these the only interests that matter, and how do we balance the interests of one against the interests of the other? It would seem that if they are both right, from their perspective, they are both right. Firstly, that it's in the interest of Alberta that the Kinder Morgan pipeline go ahead, and if it those British Columbians who are opposed to it, if they're right to say that it's in the interest of British Columbia that it doesn't go ahead, then the question is, how do we resolve that conflict of interest? And then there's the question of who gets to decide, basically.
The thing I notice about this conversation, though, is it's actually a really reconciliatory, like within this thread, it's actually really reconciliatory. Rob is not in the main. Rob, you make some good. Rob says Vicky makes some good points, and everyone is like, "Oh, I see your point," but which is really an intelligent way to debate. Mm-hmm. It's not like "screw you, I don't like you."
Right. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And if I may say so, very Canadian too.
Yeah.
Right. Because we want to get along with each other if we possibly can. I've often thought that Canada is a country built on the basic premise that if we just try hard enough, we can all get along together.
Right.
And the central part of that, getting along with each other, is recognizing other people and other people's views as legitimate. You may disagree with them, but you can recognize that they have those views, that they have their reasons, they're not being irrational necessarily. At the same time, and maybe this is my British background, what I want to say is that the facts won't necessarily make agreement always possible. It may be that the facts are in favor of one side rather than another.
And it's okay to disagree.
It's okay to disagree, but you can do so respectfully. It's one thing that I think is very important is to treat people with respect. So question what they say. Don't go after the person. Don't let your emotions get in the way of a civilized conversation.
Do you have advice if emotions are getting in the way?
That's more a psychologist.
Okay, not your field. Okay.
Yeah, but I think just firstly be aware when your emotions are getting. When you're feeling yourself agitated. I find when I'm typing away, engaged in an argument, I know that my emotions are engaging when I start talking to myself. Mm-hmm. When I start speaking aloud the things that I'm typing, then I know that my emotions are engaged. But if I'm not doing that, then it's usually a good sign that my emotions are being kept at bay. Then people may have other techniques for recognizing, but the first thing is to recognize when your emotions are getting away. Look at what people are saying rather than what you think that they're saying. Look at what they're actually saying. Deal with their argument rather than the person. Don't criticize the person. Criticize the claims if you want to criticize the claims. But always focus on the things that they say, not the person who's saying it. That's one of the major important things I think about thinking objectively and rationally.
Do we want to continue with this one? There's another one I want to ask you about. Let's look at something I posted today. I don't know if that's it. Clicking on here. We're talking about what engages people, and that was the topic convinces me to engage, desire to have a life outside the internet, engage in all the time. Yeah, okay, that's... I asked why people participate. But we'll find this one here. Sorry, we're live. We're doing this live. And it's the one here about people kind. Now, I have not heard, this is what I wrote, I have not heard the term people kind. Do you use the term people kind instead of mankind? And this is in response to what Justin Trudeau was caught on video saying to these women. They asked a question about religious Friday, and they said mankind, and Trudeau said, well, we don't use mankind, we use people kind. And it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke, but I felt a little bit offside. And he's getting some heat for it. But kind of the conversation has been a bit slammy in some ways. I don't know if we want to take the time to look at that, but this was one of the comments here I want to bring up. I mean, we're getting some of the memes, but it's kind of interesting because I don't think people actually answered the question. They just went into the
right.
Trudeau is
yes,
yeah. But this is a good one. I switched to humankind instead for about 10 years now. There's a big difference between person and human. We have human rights, not person rights. I expect in future human rivaling sentiments will be defined as persons but not humans, and whole landscapes of rights will be upended as a result.
Yep.
So, is it really about, like, coming in? This felt a little bit, I'm not criticizing, I'm just making an observation. They came in with their own bias about what they think Trudeau did, and the assumption of what I was thinking about this, because I'm making but I actually wasn't making a joke. I was asking, do you use people kind, or do you use mankind? I want to know that.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we have to be clear exactly what the question is.
Yeah.
Is it appropriate for someone to use the term mankind as opposed to people kind and humankind? I think that I have to say I think I agree with that statement there. I prefer to use humankind when I'm talking about humans. But as was suggested there, people kind is a broader concept because it may be that there are some non-human persons.
Yeah.
From a legal perspective, corporations are non-human persons.
Right. And there are people that do not identify as male or female.
Exactly. But they will still be humans.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And, of course, from a moral perspective, one could make the case that many non-humans are also persons in the moral sense that they have moral standing, they have interests that should be taken into account, and so on. So you can use the term person. I would prefer the term humankind when just talking about humans because it is what it says on the label.
Right.
It is what it says on the can. Whereas mankind, of course, is somewhat antiquated, somewhat outdated, and certainly has its origins in some kind of sexist male origin hierarchy structure that has been in existence for most of human civilization. So I think that makes perfect sense. In terms of, the comments that come here against Trudeau, of course, some individuals who, for one reason or other, legitimate or otherwise, are critical of Justin Trudeau may find that something to be laughed at and ridiculed and so on. But there's a point to it. I mean, there's reasons behind it.
Right.
And if someone wants to criticize it, they should criticize the reasons behind it, not just laugh at it. Laughter is one of the easiest ways to dismiss an argument, effectively, rhetorically. If you laugh at it, then you close down debate because it's a joke, right? But maybe it's something that should be taken seriously. Maybe there's a reason to say something. Maybe it's a reason to think that it's true, even if it sounds like a joke.
Right. Yeah, turning it in, because it's interesting because both sides do this, is they will take something that they don't like and they'll turn it into a humor. And there's nothing wrong with laughter. I think it's healthy, but it also, I think, back in, I'm going to use my Alberta example, but the late Jim Prentice used the term he talked about, you have to look in the mirror when you're talking about your finances. And people turn that into such a ridiculous, it became a hashtag of Prentice blames Albertans, was the hashtag on Twitter. But what he actually said, if you actually listen to what he said, there was a lot of validity in what he actually said. And we didn't have that actual opportunity to unpack the comment. We went to joke. And maybe it was because we were feeling maybe personally defensive because maybe we felt he was right subconsciously. But we turned it that way. And we've done that the right does that, the left does that. It's interesting that we do turn that we don't want, maybe we're afraid of the actual discussion. And we turn it into a joke because we're more comfortable with that.
And it's a lot easier than to actually think things through and to look at the comment in context. If you see it in context, then you can usually get a different impression than if you see it in isolation. Context can often make a huge difference to determining or interpreting what the meaning is.
Yeah.
What they're really trying to get across. So looking at things in context, that takes a little bit of time. When I'm on the internet and I see a view expressed that I think is puzzling or strange or doesn't seem to make much sense to me, I try to track down the source. As far as possible, I try to track down the source. And as often as not, when you track it down, it turns out they didn't really say what they're presented as saying. Well, they certainly didn't mean what they're presented as meaning most of the time when you see it in context. That's not always the case, but at least if you go to the source, if you find out a clear, authoritative statement of what they said, especially if you get it from the person themselves, right, you have a much better basis on which to decide whether you agree with what they said or not.
Right. Is there anything else we need to talk about in this? We've unpacked this for a little bit over an hour.
No, I don't think so. I think it's great.
Great. Is there a way that we can find you on social media? If not, that's okay.
Surprisingly, I tend to sort of keep my distance to some extent from social media, and a bit choosy in particular about the conversations I get involved in.
Oh, interesting.
No, I mean, I don't have a webpage, and apart from Facebook, that's my primary public media presence, I think.
Okay, fair enough. You can find me, of course, Facebook, Kevin Olenek. You can add me as a friend. You can like, agree, or disagree the podcast on Facebook as well. Follow me on Twitter at KVOLE or at ARD the podcast. Instagram, KVOLE. SoundCloud, KVOLE. Spreaker.com, KVOLE. We soon will be on iTunes and Podbean. That is coming. And subscribe on YouTube as well. Thanks for joining.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And we will talk to you all very soon. Thanks for joining as well. See you soon.